In February 1992, a forensic artist walked into a room at the New York Police Department carrying a set of photographs that had nothing to do with a criminal case. His name was Frank Domingo, and for 2 decades his job had been building composite sketches of suspects from eyewitness memory and comparing faces for courtroom identification. That week his subject was not a suspect. It was a 4,500-year-old monument sitting on the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Domingo laid out the confirmed royal statues of Pharaoh Khafre, the undisputed ones held in the Cairo Museum next to detailed photographs and survey measurements of the face of the Great Sphinx. He measured the angle of the jaw, he measured the relationship between the cheekbones and the eyes, he measured the way the face sat on its axis. And when he finished, he wrote something down that should have changed how the entire world talks about the most famous face in ancient history. The proportions did not match, not wildly, not obviously, but in the precise structural way a trained forensic eye is built to catch, and an untrained one walks straight past. His report barely made a ripple. It was filed away, cited occasionally in footnotes, and largely forgotten by the mainstream of Egyptology. That could have been the end of it. Except more than 30 years later, someone fed the same raw measurements, the same survey data, and the same forensic logic into an artificial intelligence model with no idea what conclusion it was supposed to reach. And it landed in almost the exact same place Domingo did with a pencil and a ruler in 1992. That is where the story actually begins. And if you have ever taken the identity of the Sphinx for granted, what follows is going to be uncomfortable. Before we go further, you need to understand exactly how confident the official story really is, because the gap between what we are told and what is actually documented is enormous. Walk up to the Sphinx today and a guide will tell you, without a flicker of hesitation, that you are looking at the face of Pharaoh Khafre, carved around 2500 BCE as part of the same building program that produced the second pyramid at Giza. That is what is printed on the plaque at the entrance. That is what is taught in textbooks. That is what 99% of documentaries repeat as settled fact. Here is what almost none of them tell you. There is no inscription anywhere on the Sphinx that names its builder, not one. In 4,500 years of erosion, burial under sand up to its neck, and repeated restoration, nobody has ever uncovered a cartouche on that monument that says Khafre made this, the identification. The entire modern world rests on exactly 3 pillars, and none of them are as solid as they sound. The first pillar is proximity. The Sphinx sits close to Khafre's pyramid and causeway, so the assumption has always been that it belonged to the same construction project. Proximity is not proof. Buildings sit near other buildings from different eras all the time. The second pillar is stylistic resemblance, some similarities between the Sphinx and other sculptural work attributed to the 4th dynasty. Style can be imitated, inherited, or coincidental across centuries. The third pillar is the one everything else quietly leans on. And it is worth slowing down on because almost nobody outside of specialist circles understands how fragile it actually is. Roughly 1,000 years after the Sphinx was supposedly carved, a young prince named Thutmose fell asleep in its shadow while out hunting in the desert. According to the story he later had carved onto a granite slab and placed between the Sphinx's paws, the Sphinx spoke to him in a dream. It told him it was suffocating under the sand that had buried it to its neck, and that if he cleared the sand away, it would make him king. That slab still exists today. It is called the Dream Stele, and it is, without exaggeration, the single strongest piece of physical evidence Egyptology has ever produced, connecting a specific pharaoh's name to the Sphinx. Here is the problem nobody puts on the plaque. The stele is damaged, badly. In the exact section where a pharaoh's name would have originally been carved, the hieroglyphs are broken and incomplete. Most Egyptologists reconstruct that missing, broken section as reading the beginning of the name Khaf, which they then complete as Khafre. Other researchers looking at the identical broken stone have argued the surviving fragment does not cleanly support that reconstruction at all, that scholars filled in a gap using the answer they already expected to find, and then pointed back at their own fill-in as confirmation. Read that carefully. The primary written evidence for who built the most recognizable monument on the planet is a damaged inscription, carved a full millennium after the fact, missing precisely the part that would have proven anything, and partially reconstructed by scholars using the name they were already looking for. That is not a hidden secret. That is sitting in plain sight in the historical record, mostly left out of the version handed to tourists at the ticket counter. To understand why any of this matters, it helps to actually picture the monument itself, because most people have never really been told its physical scale. The Great Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau in Egypt, carved from a single outcrop of limestone bedrock, roughly 240 feet long from paw to tail, and about 66 feet tall at the crown of the head. It was not assembled from imported blocks, stacked one on top of another the way the pyramids were. Whoever carved it cut it directly out of the ground it still sits on today, which is part of why dating it has always been such a nightmare for researchers. You cannot carbon date solid limestone the way you can date organic material, and you cannot compare it against a typical statue produced in a workshop, because nothing else on the entire planet was carved quite like it in place from a single mass of living rock. That uniqueness is exactly why questions about its age and its identity have never fully gone away, no matter how many times the official story gets repeated as though it were beyond dispute. This question is also nowhere near as new as a viral AI headline might make it sound. In 1974, a Senegalese historian and scientist named Cheikh Anta Diop stood in front of a UNESCO symposium in Cairo and made an argument the room was clearly not ready for. Using linguistic evidence, cultural continuity between ancient Egypt and other African societies, and his own scientific testing of pigmentation in mummified remains, Diop argued that ancient Egyptian civilization was fundamentally an African civilization, built and populated by black African people, and that generations of Western scholarship had worked, consciously or not, to separate Egypt from Africa's story and place it somewhere more comfortable for European academic assumptions. The symposium did not end in agreement. Several scholars in that room pushed back hard, but Diop's work did not disappear, and it was never seriously dismantled through evidence. It simply stopped being engaged with by the mainstream of the field. More than 50 years later, it remains foundational to an entire tradition of African historical scholarship, with its own methodology, its own evidence base, and its own decades of peer engagement. Even if most people watching this have never once heard his name in a classroom, it matters, because a question about facial proportions and erosion patterns on a 4,500-year-old monument is not an isolated art history footnote. It is a question with 50 years of serious weight already resting on it, argued by credentialed people long before any of the current technology existed. It is also worth knowing that some of the earliest people to describe the Sphinx's face in writing were not building an academic argument at all. They were simply describing what stood in front of them. The 19th century French writer Gustave Flaubert, visiting Giza decades before modern Egyptology had constructed its consensus, described the face plainly as having thick lips and a broad, flat nose, features he associated without hesitation or agenda with African physiognomy. The French scholar Constantin Volney made a similar observation a generation earlier and went further, remarking on the strange cruelty of Europeans traveling to admire this face while participating in a system that enslaved people who shared its features. These men were not activists building a case. They were travelers writing down exactly what they saw decades before an entire academic industry formed around telling everyone what they were supposed to see instead. Now back to Frank Domingo, because his story deserves more detail than a single paragraph. Domingo was not an archaeologist chasing a theory. He was a working forensic artist whose entire career, first with the NYPD and later teaching forensic art at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, revolved around comparing faces with total neutrality, because a wrongful identification in his line of work could put an innocent person behind bars. He had no stake whatsoever in Egyptology's internal politics, no book deal writing on a dramatic conclusion, and no reason to manufacture controversy in a field that was not even his own. His entire professional reputation depended on being right about faces in situations where getting it wrong could cost an innocent person their freedom, which is a far higher bar for accuracy than most academic footnotes are ever held to. When he ran his comparison in the early 1990s, using the same confirmed Khafre statues nobody disputes and detailed photographic surveys of the Sphinx's face, he found that the proportions did not line up the way you would expect if both faces belonged to the same man. The angle of the face was different, the jaw sat differently. It was not a wild, obvious mismatch visible from across a room. It was a subtle structural discrepancy, precisely the kind a trained forensic eye is built to catch, and an untrained one walks straight past. At the time, his finding made a small ripple in alternative history circles, and then mostly disappeared, one dissenting technical voice against more than a century of settled academic consensus. Easy to file away, easy to forget. So here is the part of the story that turns this from an old, dusty debate into something being tested again in real time. Someone took the exact same category of question Domingo answered by hand in 1992 and put it to Elon Musk's Grok AI, feeding it published measurement sets, historical survey drawings, and Domingo's own comparative data, then asking a direct question based purely on proportion. Does the face on the Sphinx match the confirmed statues of Khafre? The AI did not hand back a new pharaoh's name. It did not claim to have solved anything, and it should not be treated as though it did, because a language model analyzing described measurements is not running an independent forensic examination the way a trained specialist with calipers and photographs is. What it did do was land in almost exactly the same place Domingo landed 3 decades earlier, flagging the same structural inconsistency between the jaw and the facial angle that a human forensic expert had identified by hand with a pencil and a ruler in 1992 without being told in advance what conclusion it was supposed to reach. That convergence is the actual point, not because a chatbot said something dramatic, but because a second method, built on a completely different foundation, arrived independently at the same mismatch a specialist trained specifically to catch mismatches had already found, and that had been sitting quietly ignored for 30 years. One dissenting voice is easy to dismiss as an outlier. A second one, arriving decades later through an entirely different process, is a great deal harder to wave away. What makes this particular comparison interesting is also what makes it limited. Domingo worked with a handful of survey photographs, physical measurements taken on site, an instinct built from actual criminal casework. He compared two faces the same way he would have compared a suspect to a witness sketch, and he still identified a structural inconsistency significant enough to formally write up. An AI model working from the same category of published data has access to something Domingo never had, every publicly recorded measurement set from decades of serious surveys of the Sphinx's face, cross-referenced at once instead of held inside one analyst's memory. And instead of smoothing the inconsistency into nothing the way you might expect from a system trained mostly on repeated mainstream consensus, it flagged the same structural mismatch sitting right there in the raw geometry. That does not prove the mismatch is real beyond dispute. It means a 50-year-old question, raised again by an unrelated method, still refuses to fully collapse under scrutiny. There is a second thread in this story that even mainstream Egyptology has never been able to fully explain away, and it comes from one of the field's own most respected voices, not from an outsider. Rainer Stadelmann spent years directing the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo. This is about as establishment as Egyptology gets, a career academic working from inside the field's own institutions, not a fringe researcher chasing attention. Stadelmann pointed out something anyone can actually see for themselves if they look at the Sphinx with fresh eyes, instead of eyes that have already been told what they are looking at. The head looks too small for the body, not dramatically or cartoonishly small, but noticeably out of proportion in a way a single, unified carving typically would not be. His explanation was that the head may have been reduced and reworked at some point after the body was originally carved, recut smaller and into a different face than whatever had existed there before. Sit with what that actually implies. One of the most credentialed Egyptologists alive was saying, using nothing but careful measurement and decades of expertise, that the face we look at today might not be the face the monument originally had. Not an outsider's theory. Not a documentary talking point. A structural observation made from inside the field's own top institution. When the same head-to-body geometry is modeled against the published survey data using modern computational methods, it lands in the same uncomfortable place Stadelmann already reached with a tape measure and a trained eye. The head and the body do not read as a single uninterrupted plan carved in one continuous pass. If that observation holds, the honest question that follows is not comfortable and is not currently answerable. Reshaped from what, and reshaped to resemble whom? There's a third thread here, and it might be the strangest one, because it has nothing to do with the face at all. It is about the ground the Sphinx sits in. In the early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch examined the walls of the enclosure surrounding the Sphinx, the deep trench cut directly into the bedrock around it, and noticed something that did not resemble ordinary wind and sand erosion. It looked like water. Specifically the kind of deep, rolling vertical weathering pattern produced by centuries of heavy rainfall running down an exposed rock face, not thousands of years of dry desert wind. Egypt has not experienced sustained rainfall like that since long before Khafre's reign. We are talking about a significantly wetter phase of North African climate that predates the dynasty, credited with building the Sphinx by a considerable margin. If Schoch is correct, and it needs to be stated plainly that the overwhelming majority of mainstream Egyptologists do not accept this conclusion, the core body of the Sphinx would have to be dramatically older than the pyramids sitting immediately next to it. Nobody serious claims this is proven. What can be said is that when the erosion patterns are modeled against known ancient climate reconstructions, the water weathering interpretation does not collapse the way you would expect a 30-year-old fringe theory to collapse under real scrutiny. It does not get proven, it also does not get ruled out. It simply sits there unresolved, exactly where it has been sitting since 1990, quietly outliving 3 decades of people calling it fringe. Schoch himself was not an outsider looking to make headlines either. He was a tenured faculty member at Boston University with a doctorate in geology and geophysics from Yale, the kind of credential that is supposed to shield a researcher from being dismissed out of hand. It did not shield him. His conclusions were met with immediate and often personal pushback from Egyptologists, who argued, understandably, that the entire chronological framework of dynastic Egypt would need to be reconsidered if he were right, a framework built from a great deal of other converging evidence that does line up cleanly with the conventional timeline. That tension, a geologist reading stone against a discipline reading history, is exactly why this particular argument has never been fully resolved in either direction. What makes Schoch's argument different from the face debate is worth pausing on. You can argue about a face for a century because faces are partly subjective, weathering makes exact measurement difficult, and reasonable experts can genuinely disagree about what a badly eroded profile once looked like. Rock is not like that. Weathering patterns in limestone follow physical laws that do not bend depending on which side of an academic argument someone happens to be on. Wind erosion carves horizontally in shallow, sweeping striations that track prevailing airflow across open desert. Sustained rainfall erosion carves vertically in deep, rolling channels that run down a rock face the way water actually falls under gravity. Those two patterns do not resemble each other, and a trained geologist reading them is not offering an opinion about ancient Egyptian art history. They are reading physics. That is precisely why this theory has survived so long, despite near-total rejection from the Egyptological mainstream. The core objection was rarely that the erosion does not look like water. The core objection was almost always that accepting it would mean rewriting the entire accepted timeline of Egyptian civilization, which is a historical objection, not a geological one. When climate reconstruction data for North Africa across the relevant range of centuries is put to the same kind of model-based analysis, it does not hand back a verdict, because nobody can produce a verdict from this category of data alone. But it also does not produce a tidy explanation that makes the water pattern quietly disappear into ordinary wind erosion the way you might expect if the theory really were as flimsy as 30 years of dismissal suggests. Now put all three threads next to each other, because that is really the entire point of walking through this. A face whose proportions do not cleanly match the pharaoh it is officially supposed to honor, flagged independently by a forensic sketch artist in 1992, and decades later by an AI model working from the same category of raw data with no expectation of what answer to produce. A head that a career Egyptologist working from inside the field's own top institution says looks physically reworked, sitting on a body that may not share its original proportions, and an enclosure wall that may be carrying erosion scars from a climate that existed long before the man the monument is officially credited to was even born. None of these are new inventions manufactured for a video. Every one of them is a real argument made by a real researcher, in some cases defended for more than 30 years inside real academic and forensic contexts. What is genuinely different now is that, for perhaps the first time, all three threads can be tested against the same body of public data inside a single continuous conversation instead of living in three separate corners of a field that mostly does not talk across its own disagreements. Each one is relatively easy to dismiss on its own. Sitting next to each other, they are considerably harder to wave away. Before wrapping up, there is one popular detail worth correcting, because so many people have been handed a version of it that simply is not true, and you do not need any artificial intelligence to prove it wrong, only a sketchbook. You have probably heard that Napoleon's soldiers shot the nose off the Sphinx with cannon fire for target practice around 1798. That story is almost certainly false. European travelers were already drawing the Sphinx without its nose in illustrations dated to the 1730s, more than 60 years before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt. One of the oldest surviving explanations comes from a 15th century Egyptian historian named Al-Makrizi, who recorded that a Sufi holy man deliberately damaged the face in the 1370s after witnessing local villagers leaving offerings at its feet, an act he considered idol worship he could not tolerate. Whether that specific account captures the complete story or not, it tells us something the Napoleon myth never could. People who lived far closer to the Sphinx in time than we do already understood it as a face significant enough to deliberately deface, centuries before modern archaeology ever laid a measuring tape against it. So here is where all of this honestly leaves us, because that honesty is really the entire point of walking through it in this much detail. Nothing here hands you a new name for the plaque at the entrance. Nothing proves a different pharaoh with certainty. Nothing confirms Schoch's water erosion theory as settled fact, and nothing an AI model outputs from prompted measurements should be mistaken for an independent scientific verdict. What decades of documented research, combined with a fresh pass through the same public data, actually gives you is three separately argued positions, built by real specialists working from real evidence, that continue to refuse to fully collapse under scrutiny. The forensic mismatch holds up as a documented finding worth taking seriously. The recarving argument holds up as a credentialed structural observation. The erosion pattern question cannot be cleanly ruled out with current evidence. That leaves three honest possibilities on the table, and it is only fair to lay out all three instead of pretending the evidence points cleanly at just one. It is entirely possible the face really is Khafre after all, and every mismatch discussed here is simply the natural result of 45 centuries of erosion, ancient restoration work, and the genuine difficulty of comparing a badly weathered outdoor monument to statues carved in a controlled workshop and preserved indoors for millennia. It is possible the head was recarved at some point after the body's original construction, smaller and different from whatever face preceded it, meaning the face we call Khafre's today is a later addition sitting on top of a much older body whose original face may simply be lost to us forever. And it is possible, though this remains by far the position with the least support inside mainstream Egyptology, that the core body of the monument predates the dynasty officially credited with building it by thousands of years, carved by people whose identity and story have not survived in any written record discovered so far. What can be said with confidence is this. The name carved into that entrance plaque has been treated as settled fact for far longer than any of us have been alive, and the documented record underneath that name has always been considerably messier than a museum placard lets on. Sometimes the truth is not a hidden chamber or a secret code buried beneath the sand. Sometimes it is simply that an entire field stopped asking the question 100 years ago because the first answer it received felt tidy enough to stop looking any further. The stone is still sitting there right now, weathered, patient, missing its nose, watching the same horizon it has watched for thousands of years, waiting for someone willing to measure it honestly instead of simply repeating what the last person said. This will not be the last monument that deserves a second, more honest look. And if that kind of history interests you, this conversation is far from over. Keep asking who decided the answer, and keep asking why the rest of us simply stopped questioning it.